So good morning, or I should say good afternoon, everyone. I'm Beth Greenwood. I'm Associate Dean for International Programs and Director of the California International Law Center. And CILC is co-sponsoring this with Aoki Center for Critical Race and Nation Studies. We are so pleased that you're here. I'd like to welcome you to today's UC Davis School of Law panel discussion about the crisis in the Ukraine. It is difficult to imagine that Russia's invasion of the Ukraine began only a week and a half ago. Virtually every day since Russia invaded the Ukraine, we have witnessed unimaginable violence and suffering and extraordinary courage on the part of Ukrainian citizens. As of yesterday, or I should say as of today, 1.7 million people have migrated out of the Ukraine to neighboring countries, with the majority entering Poland, but also seeking refuge in Moldova, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, and some to Russia and Belarus, either by choice or by force. And the majority of those migrating are women, children, and the elderly, because when men between the ages of 18 to 60 are conscripted and must remain in the Ukraine. While we don't know what will eventually happen, we do know that violence and terror will continue. The UN High Commission on Refugees says it expects 5 million people to leave the Ukraine, already creating a major humanitarian crisis. This war has happened at lightning speed. Every day brings something unanticipated, and we don't know how it will eventually end. But there is no doubt that the worldwide order that has existed for the past 70 years is now gone, and we are entering a new world order, one characterized by uncertainty and conflict. The Ukraine crisis has so many dimensions that we can only begin to comprehend their meaning. Humanitarian refugee crisis, worldwide financial impacts, domestic and international security, questions of international law and justice, geopolitics, and so much more. Today, we're going to consider just some of the issues that have emerged, especially around the refugee and resulting humanitarian crisis, and what got us there in the first place. We look forward to continued conversations about other aspects of the Ukrainian crisis in the future. I'd like to introduce our expert panelists who are here today to help us with our conversation and to gain new knowledge about this issue. The first is Professor Raquel Aldana. She is a UC Davis faculty member and co-director for the Aoki Center for Critical Race and Nation Studies. Professor Aldana has done extensive research and teaching in the areas of immigration law and policy and international human rights. Professor Aldana will focus on the scope and scale of the humanitarian Ukrainian refugee crisis. Professor Joanna Regulska, to her right, wait, she's down there. To her right is is our Vice Provost and Dean of Global Affairs here at UC Davis, and a Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. Vice Provost Regulska has engaged in extensive research in Eastern Europe, including the Ukraine and Georgia. She'll talk about what we've learned from past invasions, especially their impact on women and girls, that might indicate what we can expect in the future. Dr. Holmes Armstead, to my left, is a retired professor from the U.S. Naval College, where he taught international law, strategy, and national security for many years. He holds both a J.D. and Ph.D., and he'll speak about the origin of the war based on the deep cultural historical differences between Russia and the Ukraine. This is the beginning of a conversation. This is going to be going on for a long time. So I thank you for coming, and I'd like to begin with Professor Aldana.
Great, can you hear me? Okay, good. Thank you so much, Associate Dean Beth Greenwood, for organizing this important discussion. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Before I begin, I do want to acknowledge that recent events are very painful and also very worrisome. And I especially want to express solidarity to anyone in the audience or even on this panel who have family in the region. So I want to focus on 3 points. First, I want to document a little bit about what we know about the scope and scale of the forced displacement that has occurred since Putin invaded the Ukraine on February 24th, which today marks 11 days of brutal force against a nation. My remarks will focus largely on Ukrainians who have crossed international borders, and as you've heard, nearing 2 million and growing by the day. But I also want to acknowledge that likely as many Ukrainians have also been forcibly displaced within the Ukrainian territory, or frankly stuck in place in extremely dangerous circumstances. We know that Putin is targeting civilians and that scores have already died. Yet, unfortunately, international law, which does not generally apply to internally displaced persons, and also just the pragmatics of an ongoing war will make it nearly impossible to render aid to those stuck in country. The Ukraine has a population of around 44 million, and while not every single region of the country has been hit by the war yet, every single Ukrainian who is in country or even abroad understands that their very independence, liberty, and human rights are at stake. I also want to acknowledge that aside from Ukrainians, there are other important groups that are also fleeing or will be pushed to flee as a result of this conflict. One important group is Russians who are in opposition to the war. We know that thousands of very courageous Russians have been protesting since the war began, and that in fact over 4,300 at least have been jailed as a result, and that's only what we know. So this political oppression against Russians is very real, but in addition, the nation's economic collapse is likely to ensue, will force many thousands to abandon their home. Forbes magazine reported that Emirates, Turkish, and Korean Air are the main carriers of Russians who are attempting to flee in flights, but many more are trying to do so on foot, and they're leaving to countries like Estonia and Finland. Once they arrive at their destination, they're also facing financial barriers based on the economic sanctions, and you may have read that many are not able to access financial institutions or their credit cards as a result of what's going on. So I'm happy to expand a bit more on other populations during Q&A, but I want to move now to offer a brief reflections on how the European Union and the US have responded to the Ukrainian situation. And I also am going to offer at the end some reflections contextualizing how the world's response to this crisis compares and contrasts to how the world has responded to other groups like Syrians, Afghans, Venezuelans, and Central Americans. So you've already heard from Associate Dean Greenwood about some of the numbers and the profiles of those fleeing. The head of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Janine Williams, called the speed of the exodus of refugees from Ukraine phenomenal. The invasion has caused Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II. And this is not going to change anytime soon. It's going to grow exponentially daily, and it's going to continue for a long time if we look back at historical patterns of other wars. And this will be the case even if Putin, this is a very unlikely scenario, abandons his plans of taking over the country. 1.7 million is the data that Associate Dean Greenwood provided. I do want to say that this number doesn't even capture those who fled Ukraine before the start of the invasion and before airports began to shut down. And these are figures we won't even know for a long time, but I mention them because I think it's important even to understand that when people flee, there's usually two separate paths that are very predetermined by access to resources and visas. And so those who had access to passports and visas, who understood what was coming, were able to flee with passports and therefore arrive at various airports of their choice and now have access to apply for asylum protections. And I want you to know that in contrast, those who are being forced to flee by foot to neighboring countries are being placed in a very different situation. So one of the things that we see repeated in this refugee crisis is this duality of treatment just based on people's ability to flee a nation and the ways that they're able to flee. So unsurprisingly, more than half of the Ukrainians fleeing by foot are doing so to neighboring countries. I have a map that you can see up there. That data is already dated because it's as of March 3rd, so those numbers are much higher. But I think it's helpful to see a map. And you see that the country with the highest rates of refugees is Poland, and there's followed by Romania, Hungary, and Moldova. It's important for you to know that Poland, Romania, and Hungary, but not Moldova and Belarus, are part of the European Union. And this matters a lot. Also, like if you even have a strategy in place, if you even have a choice as a refugee, you also have to think about if I go, where do I go, right? Because the idea of being able to access EU territory has huge implications, both on potentially the ability to obtain international protections, but more importantly, access to perhaps more resources than you might be able to get in non-EU nations. The reality is that the media always focuses, sometimes for good reasons, because the numbers force us to focus in those regions, but sometimes for not so good reasons. We tend to focus only on the way that refugee populations impact Western nations, and we ignore the fact that actually most refugee populations of the world are stuck in emerging economies, which lack the resources, but also the visibility and the social media to be able to continue to ask for aid. But I wanted you to understand the choices that refugees are making. So fleeing to Poland makes a lot of sense because of the idea that it will trigger better protections for them. It's already been mentioned that a lot of those who are fleeing include the vulnerable. I read by UNICEF that at least 500,000, and again, this data is already dated, of those who are fleeing are teenagers, and now I'm making the connections that that's because of the forced conscription laws that are in place. And my colleague, Joanna Regulska, is going to focus more on impacts on women and other vulnerable communities. So I will move now to what has been the response of the international community. So one piece of good news in this terrible tragedy is that so far Ukrainians have received what I think probably should be, at least in the immediate time, the response to people who flee horrible conditions such as war. It may be surprising to some of you to hear me say that it is actually amazing that neighboring nations have not shut down the doors to Ukrainians. The only reason for this amazing treatment or exceptional treatment is that for geopolitical reasons, right? So there's several reasons that people provide, but one of the strongest is that we understand, right, the implications of this conflict and the way that it will transform world order. But it's also true that there has been contrast and comparisons drawn to, say, Syrians and Afghanis and other pockets of forcibly displaced individuals who are from non-European nations that have received very disparate treatment that are also giving rise to concerns about the degree to which this is also being driven by racialized issues or other types of dismissals about the oppression and trauma suffered by certain communities. So while I don't want to dwell on this too much, I just want to give you like one example of this. As you know, Syria has been at war since 2011. The war is still ongoing. Data is horrific. It suggests that more than 200,000 people have died. If you've been paying attention, the images are horrific in terms of the destruction of the infrastructure of this beautiful country and the scale of human suffering. And so we're talking that nearly 3.2 refugees, I think it's higher than that, actually have attempted to seek protections abroad, including in EU countries. And while this story is very, very complex, we are all very aware of the ways in which we have tried to stop, we the world, the European Union tried to stop, right, their arrival in EU countries through practices like interdiction in the Mediterranean. So I'm not going to focus on that too much, except to say we need to keep this in mind. And what's really going on is that what these nations are trying to prevent is triggering of non-refoulement protections under international law that would force them to provide protections under the UN Refugee Convention that are not available when they're not in territories that are part of the EU. This stands in sharp contrast to what has happened with respect to Ukrainians. And again, I'm celebrating this. So on March 3rd, the EU Commission activated a temporary protective directive that allows Ukrainians the ability to access legal temporary stays for up to 3 years. They will have access to residency permits, to labor markets, and to education. It is also, however, important to note that Ukrainians are being discouraged from applying for asylum and refugee protections that would be the only path for them to obtain permanent settlement in the countries, and more importantly, to be able to aid their families who stayed behind. These types of temporary protections do not give them any rights to be able to unify with family. The US similarly extended what we call in the United States TPS, or temporary protected status, on Ukrainians already in the US as of March 1st, 2022. These means that for 3 years, again, Ukrainians who do not have criminal histories, who are living in the US without authorization, are going to be able to stay, to work for at least 18 months, and maybe potentially longer if it is extended. According to data, this is about 75,000 Ukrainians who will benefit from this protection. But again, it will apply retrospectively. And so those who are arriving now will not be protected because it's as of March 1. And again, no path to family unification and no path to permanent protections. So one question we should be asking is, why not refugee status? Frankly, the answer is complex. I have very little time, so I'm just going to offer a few reflections. One of the reasons is that the refugee system is really broken and overwhelmed, and it has not been working for a really long time. Currently, UNHCR estimates that there are 26.6 million refugees, and this is probably an undercounting. It grows every single year, and yet fewer than 1% of those are resettled permanently in other countries. Around 70% of these refugees originate from only 5 countries, all of them from non-European nations. So far, I think this is going to shift because of what's happening. Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. I alluded earlier, right, that this situation, this intractable situation, has had varied responses that are really imperfect. And for example, for Afghanis, who are one of the largest populations, the lack of response. This is a country that has been at war for 40 years. One of the concerns that I have is that our patience and our endurance for trauma, right, shifts not just for the media, but for the public. And I worry about how long are we going to sustain it for the Ukrainians? Because what we see happening to Afghans, right, is that it's been going on for so long that there are protracted refugee populations of people who have literally been born into refugee camps, who have been in refugee status for longer than 35 years. And we haven't found a solution. So I think it's important for us to understand that the system is broken, and that's what is happening. Ukrainians are basically being superimposed into this pre-existing tragedy. So let me close with a few reflections. I'm glad to have more of a discussion with you. So despite the enormous tragedy that we are witnessing, there is room to celebrate that the world community has come together and mobilized quickly not to abandon the Ukrainian people, excluding its refugees. We should continue to do this. We should also see this as an opportunity to reflect on how we can push our nations and ourselves, including the US, to respond at least equivalently to other communities of refugees, irrespective of whether they are perceived to have the same geopolitical significance. Humanitarian protection should not turn on political calculations, but in human rights considerations. And we should expand the same levels of empathy and compassion to the suffering of other people. In a few weeks, a small group of students from UC Davis is traveling with me and Professor Robert Irwin to Tijuana to visit shelters that have been housing refugees from Central America, Venezuela, Haiti, Cameroon, Russia, and many other parts of the world. And as you know, it is because of policies like Title 42 and the Remain in Mexico policies that we have had for years that have led us to shut down borders to these humanitarian crises right across the street from us in our neighboring country of Mexico. I mention this because we have to be vigilant about these issues and understand that what is happening to Ukrainians is happening to many other peoples of the world. And our obligation is to capitalize on this moment to reimagine what protections for refugees could mean for the future. Thank you.
Yes, we're all done, and we're going to take questions at the end because there's so much to talk about. Vice Provost, Provost.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Professor Greenwood, Johnson, and to all of you actually for being engaged in this incredibly painful and stressful moment. So just a full disclosure, I am originally from Poland. I live here in the United States for quite a few decades now. But I do have a family in Poland, and of course I have a lot of friends. And I have worked in the 90s very closely with my Ukrainian colleagues, building grassroots citizen participation, advancing local government reform, building local democratic institutions. And seeing all of this being destroyed is just truly heartbreaking. Because 2 decades, more than decades, almost 3 decades of a very hard work basically was destroyed and gone, and who knows what's going to happen in the future. This is not the first time that the Russian leaders, including President Putin, are actually invading nations around. We're going to hear more with our panelist colleague about the history. But to contextualize my own work, we have seen Chechnya and Grozny was completely flattened. We have Georgia, and I will talk more about it. We see meddling in Armenia and Azerbaijan. We've heard recently about the peacekeeping troops invading Kazakhstan. We have Ukraine going on for 8 years and continue. So this is a pattern. This is a pattern and desire to rebuild Russian Empire. Some agree easily, like Belarus, and some do not. And this is where the tension is. So learning about the history is actually extremely important because it just does not happen like this. There is a long history behind of why these actions are taking place. Several years ago, in mid-2000, we actually a little bit even earlier, colleagues of mine received the National Science Foundation grant to Professor Beth Michnik and Peter Kabachnik. And the grant was to examine the livelihood of internally displaced population. IDPs. So we have refugees and we have IDPs. In fact, as Professor Aldana said, we have 26 million of refugees, but actually we have 48 millions of IDPs. So this is a huge segment of our population around the world, which got displaced because of war, because of climate change, because of political unrest, variety of reasons. So in Russia, in Georgia, in 1992 and 93, there was a Russian invasion in Abkhazia, and we have a breakaway region of Abkhazia. And then in 2008, there was another Russian invasion in South Ossetia. Several thousands of people have been displaced immediately. Many more later. Right now, just in Georgia, we have about 3 million people in a human assisted need. We're talking 2022. And I really want you to calculate these wars, these invasions were many decades ago. And we have still millions of people who are absolutely living in unbelievably difficult and stressful and poor conditions. So there are some lessons learned, and I'm gonna try to go through some of them, and then maybe we can, if you have questions, we can talk more. So first of all, the impact is visible, and impact will remain for years to come. Impact will not go away. And that's exactly what President Putin wants to do. He wants to have a permanent impact, to flatten Ukraine and displace people as much as possible. So then the country, the nationhood, the spirit, all of this is destroyed, displaced, flattened, kind of eliminated from potential, in his mind, threats. Secondly, the estimates are that, so the 44 million, that at least maybe 10, 15, maybe more million people will actually leave Ukraine. And very often when you think about those who are fleeing, those are actually the resourceful, those are the skillful, those that are stronger than very often those who are leaving behind, for a variety of reasons. It's nothing wrong. People make a decision one way or the other. But that exodus means that the country in the future is going to be lacking skilled labor. They will be lacking educated people. They will be lacking leaders and so forth. So that's exactly another goal of how to destroy the nation. International institutions, as we saw from Professor Aldana talk, and also we know, it's incredible, unprecedented solidarity. It actually strengthens the European Union. It brings people together in a variety of ways. Yet we also know that the enthusiasm for support has its limits. Initial support is great. But I also hear already from my colleagues and friends in Poland, people are getting tired. People don't have financial resources to keep on pulling. So the individual support that we see and the incredible speed with which the individual support was unleashed requires really systematic approaches by the government. And we don't hear about that. So if Poland received 1 million of refugees, there are numbers of questions that immediately have to be started asked, and the solutions and strategy have to be in place because it's 1 million people. That means that more or less, sooner or later, every town, every village gonna have some one or the other kind of relationship with refugees. The influx of refugees at this scale gonna change the neighboring countries. They're gonna change cultural practices, social, economic, political. They will change institutions. They will change responses. And that means that will unleash the ugly side of the mobility. Increased racism, discrimination, marginalization, all kinds of things that are in every society, and very often they become unleashed when the actual crisis takes place. Somebody's gonna have to deal with it. The incidents are already happening. We saw an incident in Kiev where the Asian and African students were not allowed to board the planes because the Ukrainians were more privileged. We saw the incident on the border of Poland and other neighboring countries. We are already seeing incidents within the countries. Racism is global, racism is taking place, and the crisis like this is just amplifies and gives permission for racism to be taking place in an open. Issues of simple notion that we might be not thinking about. What it means to have home, what it means to belong to somewhere, what it means to be safe. Those notions are suddenly being shattered. People don't have homes, people don't know where they belong, people don't feel safe. So when these principles, the tenets of our everyday life are becoming shattered, you might wonder what is actually going to happen to those people when they don't have the ability to reconnect. The families are getting split. And these impacts the disruption of these social relations and these notions actually will have impact for generations to come. And again, from my work in Georgia, it was very clear that children were born into the status of being an IDP. Children were born into the status of being refugee. They never know what is home. They never know what is a full family with a grandmother and grandfather and father and so forth. Somehow, somebody somewhere has to deal with it and address. We don't hear that yet. None of the international institutions has yet spoken about any of these aspects of the processes that are already taking place. What my research in Abkhazia and in South Ossetia has shown that something that many of us, women and men and feminists know, women are extremely resilient. They're extremely well organized. They are the leaders when the situation pushes them. Very often the cultural practices might not allow them to claim that agency that they have. So women are taking leadership role right now. We're already seeing this in just bringing the families to the borders, making decisions, engaging in protecting the families and their children and the elderly family members, because we have obviously a whole spectrum of those moving. So they basically are taking charge of the process of displacement right now, and it's happening. And this will not go away quickly away from them. So I think we need to recognize that ability to shift the role. Secondly, women are assuming financial responsibility. As we speak, they are making decisions about the finances. They are making decisions how to spend money. Those are again, for many new cultural practices that they might have not engaged before. One other thing that is very important, and that is the role of social networks. When the disruption comes, social networks are disrupted too. But actually, women are phenomenally good in building social networks. And these social networks, research have shown, are extremely important for the future, because the future, how people are going to be adjusting, the future is dependent on those social networks that exist. And finally, women have an incredible capacity to adjust. We saw this in context of Georgia. We saw how they were able to pick up any job, while men were having a really hard time because their men who their position of the breadwinner was suddenly shattered and questioned. Women went and then engaged in all kind of economic generating activities. So to maybe end up, I would like to hear more from media, from international institutions, the recognitions that these are not generic refugees. These are women, these are adolescent girls, these are young children, these are elderly women. Each of this group has very, very different needs, and each of this group going to have a different kind of vulnerabilities. Clearly, the issue of the human rights violation was already mentioned, but what about the sexual and gender violence base? Adolescent girls, women, mothers, all kinds of things are already happening and will be happening, and we know. And that means that we need services for unwanted pregnancies, services for rape and violence, services that need to be provided to these women and girls. Finally, one additional comment about the economic empowerment. So often, the way media is presenting to us what is happening is through the prism of victimhood. So the women, they're poor, they're grabbing their children, they're moving. But I wish actually that the conversation was about the empowerment, the economic empowerment, the social empowerment, how these women will be integrated in the countries in which they were forced to move, what the institutions, national, local, will do to allow them to become more self-reliant, because they do want to earn money. They have skills, they have knowledge. But the system has to help them to actually reclaim that lost identity and that lost status of what they had in Ukraine. I'll stop here, and there's plenty more to go about to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Armstead, who's going to bring us contextual information about what we've been discussing so far.
Good afternoon. If we can turn to the map for just a moment, I want to lay out the geography before we start with the history. The eastern portion and to the center of Ukraine across the Dnieper River, which you see in the center of our map, and on into the next third or so are flat, very fertile plains, similar to Iowa, Nebraska, if you will. The very western portion, Poland, the western portion of Ukraine down into Romania, that's the Carpathian Mountains with a typical mountain climate, cold, snowy in the winter, and a Mediterranean climate in the south, where Odessa, near the Crimea, this area, very much a Mediterranean climate. Colder in the north, obviously, than in the south. And the geography has a great deal to do with the history. Ukraine is divided into 29 oblasts, which includes the major administrative districts in the 4 largest cities. These oblasts, the ones you will be most familiar with, of course, Donetsk and Lugansk, comprise the Donbass area, which has been contested since 2014. Well, Ukraine. The word itself, Ukraina, in the language of the Ukrainians, means borderlands. So it's not like when we talk about Germany or France or Italy, there's a genetic relationship. There are people who have cultural identity with the land over a long period of time. Throughout its recent history, since the Middle Ages, there are approximately 11 major ethnic groups which comprise the Ukraine. There's evidence of human habitation for the past 34,000 years, including a early and significant Neanderthal presence. In the Middle Ages, approximately 860 or so, the Dnieper River was used as a major highway by the Norsemen. They came down from the Baltic through this area, settling in some parts of it, trading in almost all of it, and down into the Black Sea. In the 860s, Rurik, one of the princes of one of the Scandinavian princes, was asked by a group of tribesmen from various tribes who couldn't decide among themselves. They wanted more order, more structure, a government to match what their neighbors looked like, if he would assume a suzerainty over parts of the Ukraine. His name was Rurik. The story of Rurik and the Boyar is very much like, for those of you interested in fantasy, very much like Arthur in the Round Table. His great-grandson, Vladimir the Great, in the 970s, brought Christianity to the Ukraine. There was conversion from the old pagan religions. Vlad's son, Yaroslav the Wise, began instituting civil society, universities, courts, was responsible for bringing scholars in to write a legal system. He was married, his second wife was the daughter of the Eastern emperor in Constantinople. So Yaroslav brought the Ukraine into Europe, as it were. Among his daughters, they're married to the King of Poland, the King of France, one of the northern Italian kingdoms, and the Prince of Novgorod. So he did very well by his daughters, telling us that women are very powerful, influential, and were part of the political landscape as the Ukraine developed. Well, moving on to early modern times, in the 1560s, the major, the hurricane, by the way, lasted until the Romanovs came into power. They lasted until the late the late 16th century in the Ukraine. So one of the principal leaders of Ukraine in the 1560s, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, was involved in wars with the other major powers at the time. The Duchy of Moscow had enlarged itself and had become much of modern Western Russia. Sweden, of course, was the principal military power in the 15th and 16th century in the Baltic. And of course, Poland and Lithuania organized themselves into a commonwealth to resist the Swedes. Well, now, where did that put the Ukrainians? They were involved in between, as I said, the name itself, borderlands. It's flat, as I described, like Iowa, Nebraska, and of course, moving troops across this area was very easy. Fertile lands, they were obviously looked upon as a prize to a number of nations. And of course, Khmelnytsky was in combat with almost all of them. He needed to seek alliances so that he could defend himself. Long war with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He decided to sue the Russians for an alliance, did so, and that was the formal relationship with the Russians, the beginning of the formal relationship with Russia. Now, he thought he was signing on to an alliance. The Russians thought, since he was paying tribute to this pre-Romanov Tsar Peter, that he had joined Russia. So this was a bit of confusion. Remember, the languages are not exactly the same. About 40% of the basis of the Ukrainian language is Russian. So there's a commonality in that Russians, Ukrainians can certainly talk to each other, much like Swedes and Norwegians, which used to be the same country until about 100 years ago. But certainly there was room for confusion. By the time of Catherine the Great, the 1790s, she had absorbed the Ukraine into the Russian political system. So it was considered a part of Russia by the Russians. Potemkin was sent south to solidify the relations with the Ukrainians, the Russia's principal enemy at the time in the south being the Turks. And Potemkin was charged with fortifying the Ukraine and Russifying it, if you will. He pursued a number of Italian architects who built the city of Odessa. Odessa is it's very much an Italianate city. It looks like someplace along the Mediterranean, a wonderful promenade along the Black Sea. The center of the city, lots of Italianate buildings, very much like that. Walking there, living there, as I taught at the National University and at Metchnikoff in the law school. It's very much like an Italian city. One begins to appreciate that. Well, we go along until the First World War. The Ukraine attempts to break away at the end of the war when the Russian Empire falls. The Romanovs are removed from power, and the Ukrainians fought a war with Lenin's government from 1919 until 1923. Very vicious war, a chance of winning. The Ukrainians came very close. But 4 years of independence, they established a democratic government. They unfortunately were not able, and it's a familiar story, not able to ally themselves with Poland, who actually did. Poland won its war of independence against Russia. They resisted the Red Forces at the time and were able to create an independent government and held that so until 1945, when they were taken over again. By an inserted communist government. 1957, Khrushchev ceded Crimea to the Ukraine. Khrushchev was Ukrainian. So the Ukraine had been very loyal. The Ukrainian Communist Party had supported him. He obviously did very well by them politically, and that was a reward, so to speak. But Crimea before then had been considered Russian property. Once again, turning to the map, if one looks at the Sea of Azov, we have Russia, of course, to the east, and you can see the connection to Crimea. That's across the straits here at the foot of the Sea of Azov. That's 3 miles. So there's a bridge that's been built there since 2014. It's been built so low that large ocean-going ships cannot get under the bridge. Clearly, a defensive mechanism. In 1992, the Ukraine declared its independence after the Soviet Union dissolved. 2 years later, after very difficult negotiations, the Budapest Memorandum was signed, which allowed for the Ukraine to cede its nuclear weapons and get rid of them. So we bought some of them, the Russians took some of them back. And the trade-off was a guarantee of Ukrainian territorial independence, sovereignty, and those things would be protected by the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and of course, Russia. Well, in 2014, of course, the Russians invaded the Crimea, and within about 6 weeks, declared its independence. The Russian parliament, the Duma, allowed for the application of Crimea after a referendum of some questionable standing was used to vote its independence and request to join Russia. The Russians accepted that almost immediately, and a war has been going on, a proxy war in the Donbass area, Lugansk, Donetsk, since 2014, with the insertion of Soviet special forces supporting separatists who want to pull away. The eastern portion, that is east of the Dnieper River, divided the country in half, about 40% of the population are Russian speakers. They were very much in support of a pro-Russian foreign policy stance when after the 2010 election. The western part of the country, that is west of the Donetsk River, a part of that had been a portion of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There were large numbers of German speakers in addition to the other ethnic groups. And of course, this area are mostly Ukraine speakers. So that will give you an idea of the geography, the history, as to how we come about the present circumstances. The cultures are very much different. Common roots, very different. The correct name culturally to refer to people in the area in the larger sense is the Kevin Rus, because of Rurik and the introduction of the Norsemen organizing the first government in the area, which does expand to what we have modernly. Thank you.
Thank you. I have to say, Dr. Armstead had sent me a series of wonderful maps. This is such a rich history, and he's really tried to collapse into 10 minutes. So we thank you so much, but it really provides an overview and insight into what is going on now. We have 5 minutes for questions or comments. Is there anybody who has a question? Yes.
Do we have a legal obligation to help Ukraine under the Budapest Agreement?
Yes.
Wow.
The guarantee with the four nations who signed the Budapest Memorandum was that they would protect the sovereignty of Ukraine, first of all, but also the territorial integrity. So that would be the legal basis for the use of force, for example, a no-fly zone, which many people have been clamoring for, at least in the very western portion, a support corridor from Poland, which is how we now are supporting the Ukrainian military with weapons, would have to be kept up with, but probably the entire country. That would be legal under that treaty.
Any questions, comments? Well, Dr. Armstead, I know we talked about, can you say just a few words about where we see this going? I think that was what we talked about.
Well, the question was from Dean Greenwood, where I see this going. I might first answer that by telling you just a little bit, very briefly, about the military situation right now. The Russian army is attacked on three fronts. If you look at the map in its entirety, so from Romania, the Romanian border on the Black Sea, around Ukraine and into Belarus at the top, which doesn't completely show here, that's roughly 270 degrees on the compass. So there are Russian forces engaged, about 190,000, coming from that entire area. 34 ships of their Navy in the Black Sea, 6 amphibious assault ships, 190,000 troops, as I mentioned, organized in 100 battalion combat battle groups, and with a threat of 40,000 Belarusian soldiers and their army also joining in the fight. We haven't seen that yet, but they are talking about it. The thrusts have been in 3 directions: across Donbass, of course, where the Russians control the border already. So there was no fighting at that border because the Donbass area was already occupied by Russian troops. An attack south on both sides from Belarus and Russia on both sides of the Dnieper River, and of course the amphibious assault joining in the Odessa area, joining with troops already stationed in Crimea. So there are pressure on the top 15 cities right now in the Ukraine. The largest portion of the military thrust is the current attack that's being organized against Kyiv. So far, the Ukrainian army seems to be holding in most areas. They've lost 3 large cities and 2 major power plants. They're doing very well. They need more weapons. The Stingers and Javelin missiles have done well against Russian armor, Russian aircraft. Approximately 10,000 Russians have been killed, 250 armored vehicles destroyed, and 70 aircraft. Where I see this going, if we can continue to supply the Ukrainian army, they can hold their own. They're not going to be able to perform counterattacks. They don't have enough forces. Their military is approximately 210,000 with 200,000 reservists. So without the air cover, they won't be able to continue this defense as they begin to attrit their own forces and use up their current weapons.
Thank you so much. So I would like to read, this morning I was in contact through Dr. Armstead with the Consulate General of Ukraine in San Francisco, and he asked that I read this message to you. Please tell the group we need support from everyone to deliver the message that Ukrainian women and children need U.S. to act and NATO to act in order to implement non-fly zones over Ukraine and to stop being afraid of Russia. So that is from the Consul General of Ukraine, Kushner, Mr. Kushner. So I wanted to share that with you.
So can I maybe say a few words about what we're doing on the campus?
Absolutely.
Because I think it's important. So we have 2 Ukrainian students. We have more Russian students. We have scholars, postdocs. We obviously, as a global university, globally engaged, we have numbers of contacts and relationships. Every day at 11 o'clock at the Memorial Union, the Slavic Student Association is tabling. If you want to take a walk, please go. They will tell you what they can do. They will tell you how you can get engaged. It's really important that we support them and that we channel our support in the right direction, because it's so easy to spread things around with no impact. There is also down the road, we're gonna obviously have a lot of displaced scholars. We as a campus are committed to inviting and bringing international scholars to the campus. If such a moment comes, please definitely talk to Dean Greenwood. We're working together with the Scholar Rescue Fund, the Institute of International Education, and also with Scholars at Risk to support. Finally, the third thing, Article 26 backpack. Please go on our web, type Article 26 backpack, take the link and spread around the news to others that you might know in Europe and other countries in our community. The Article 26 backpack is a software platform that allows you to protect your documents. While this, at the moment when you're trying to fight for your life, is not important, these documents are going to be of critical importance to reestablish yourself. any document. So we are urging people, this was a platform developed by UC Davis. We are urging people to save the documents because in the future you're gonna need. And I see somebody raising their hand, so not that I'm in charge, but.
Well, you talk about the Slavic Student Association tabling in the Memorial Union. What exactly is that? So every day at 11, what do you say?
It's the Slavic Student Association here on the campus. Those are the students who might be of Ukrainian descent. Those are the students of Russian descent. Those might be students from Poland. We have a student association, and they're working with the Ukrainian community in Sacramento, with others. So they might be able to channel our engagement and respond to the exact needs. Because there are numbers, as always, in the situation of crisis, there are numbers of possibilities.
Thank you so much, Vice Provost Regulska. And I see it's 1 o'clock, a lot of people have classes, so we're gonna have to stop now. I thank you, Vice President. Vice President. And Dr. Armstead for sharing so much on this panel. Thank you.